Good morning. My name is Mark Baldassare, and I'm President and CEO of the Public Policy Institute of California. Thank you all for joining us today. PPIC is pleased to present this virtual program featuring California Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber. This event is part of PPIC's 2021 speaker series on California's future. As a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political candidates or parties for public office. We'd like to thank the sponsors of this series for their underwriting support. These organizations are listed on your screen and on our website. This series is also funded by the PPIC Donor Circle and the PPIC Corporate Circle, individuals and organizations that provide generous support to PPIC. Please consider joining us as a sponsor or donor to make more programs like today's possible. More information is available at ppic.org. Before we begin, if you have a question for the Secretary of State, please send an email to the email address on the screen and include your name and organization along with your question. Yes, to ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We will have time at the end of the program to devote to questions. And now I would like to welcome our featured speaker, Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber.
Well, thank you so very much for having me with you today. I really appreciate the opportunity. Always enjoy coming to PPIC. You do great work, and so I'm honored to be with you this morning.
Well, congratulations on your appointment, and thank you for your service at this critical time for the state and the nation. I was reminded this morning before our meeting that the first time you and I met was actually in February 2013.
Wow.
Soon after you were elected, PPIC made the determination with the change in term limits, and that was the year in which there was a change in districts also, that we were going to meet with all the new members of the legislature. And I remember that our meeting with you was one of the first meetings that we had, and I was really impressed with your knowledge, your commitment, the background that you came from, and your interest in gathering facts and making the best decisions. And it made a big impression on all of our staff, and we paid a lot of attention to what you were doing. And we also, it was really through that meeting that we became committed to the idea of meeting with all the new members of the legislature, because we met with you, and it was just so meaningful to us. And there's a possibility that we might be meeting with another Dr. Weber in a few weeks as a new member, and we'll get to that later. But I thought, how interesting where we are today. So I wanted to start by asking you, from your new vantage point as a Secretary of State, what are the most important steps that we can take to expand voter turnout and diversity in the electorate in California?
Well, this last election, it was driven by a whole bunch of variables. Some of them we never want to repeat again, of course. But it said to us very clearly that people will come out to vote when they believe they have something to vote for or vote against. And so we want to emphasize the fact that there's always something to vote for, that this democracy is worth saving and worth preserving. And so people need to understand that. And sometimes we become rather lazy about it and took it for granted and assumed it would always be there for us. And I kept saying the democracy is fragile. That we have to defend it. We have to be prepared for it. And people initially didn't take me very seriously a couple of months before January 6th. And then they came right back and said, you said it was fragile. And I said, it is fragile because it's dependent upon the goodwill of people, and even though we have the laws of the land and so forth and so on, but those laws are created by people. But we did see some other things in this last election that we should always try to emulate. We have, I served for a number of years on the elections committee, and we had instituted a lot of things that we know that really work in terms of elections. We know that if you give people lots of choices, if you give them more time, you create an atmosphere that is agreeable for them to vote, that they will then participate. We knew that, but people were hesitant about doing it, a lot of naysayers. And so we had a few people who took us up on it. But this pandemic, interestingly enough, one of the positive things of the pandemic is that most folks had kind of danced around changing the structure, but didn't want to do all of it. Mm-hmm. The pandemic pushed us into the water. It was like, you want to learn to swim, but you don't want to get in the water. And it pushed us into the water. And I've been meeting with registrar voters across the state virtually, and every last one of them has said that what we did last time was the best thing ever. And I said, what we did was we said to people, it is important that you vote, so important that we're going to make it convenient, that we're going to give you more than one way that you can vote, that you can either vote in person, you can bring it to the ballot boxes, you can be there that day, you can mail it in. We took away the excuses that people had, that it's too inconvenient, I got to go to work, I don't know what's going on. I mean, we took away all those excuses and we saw the increase. And I think it is important that we continue to focus upon that we have an opportunity to give our voters more than one way in which they can vote. And so we're going to be looking at all of those different opportunities that are there. And many of our counties are saying they want to continue it. They want to continue this push. So I think that's number one, that we have to really create options for people and a convenience for people to vote, and not just make it convenient for those who have the resources and transportation and can take off from work and so forth and so on. So we have to make it very convenient for people to vote. And if I think they do that, they will realize that we care about them enough to make it okay for them to vote. We also have to educate our people about voting. We've done very little to really help people understand how the journey to acquire the vote has been a long, difficult journey for everyone who wasn't a white male and sometimes a landowner, that everyone has fought for it. And it's important that you have it. And so we're looking at doing some things in the Secretary of State's office to really educate people about the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That people think that Voting Rights Act gave Black people the right to vote. And that was not it. It protected our right to vote. It shielded us from all these obstacles and challenges. And that should arm people with what is going on across the nation right now, that's trying to make voting more difficult and trying to narrow down the population that people think ought to be voting. California is fortunate that we have eliminated almost every category except for one from voting. If you're a citizen, you can vote. If you're walking up and down the streets, you are qualified to vote. If you're a citizen. The only thing and it's only if you're not in prison, you have the right to vote. Prop 17 basically took away all those. Are you on parole or probation? Which one is it? One way or the other. Everyone in California who's a citizen who is not in prison, not jail, but prison, has the right to vote, which means we should go out into all of these communities and let people know that that veil has been lifted and that they now can register to vote and should vote. And I think those kinds of things will increase the population of those who are going to vote and participate.
Thank you. Really amazing to think about where we are today in California and where we've come really in just a few short years. I spent a little bit of time this week looking at the Secretary of State website, which I spend a lot of time on, especially during elections. But just to put this in perspective, 17,785,000 voters in the 2020 election. That was a record. 3 million more than in 2016, 4 million more in what was also a very high turnout election in 2008, the Obama election in 2008, where people also got the sense it's important that the turnout among registered voters, 80%. We hadn't seen a turnout like that since 1976 when Carter was running for president. The turnout among eligible, that is everyone who's eligible to vote, 70%. We hadn't seen a number. You have to go back to 1952 when Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president to find a turnout like that. Looking at the current registration figures, 88% of California eligible voters now are registered to vote, 22 million registered voters today. That's 4.5 million more than there were 6 years ago in 2015. So I mean, the numbers are quite amazing. And but you know, I'm sure you look at the numbers and you think, like I do, where do we fall short? You know,
Right.
where do we need to do the work? Is it age? Is it income? Is it race, ethnicity? Is it region? Today, the new supplemental vote came out from 2020. So, Dr. Weber, you know, you're a scholar, you're an elected official for a long time. You look at the numbers and where we are and where do we fall short?
Well, I tell people all the time that, you know, and that no number is good unless it's 100% in terms of voting and participation. So while we have a lot to brag about, we have a lot to be concerned about as well. You know, when you look at the number of registered voters and you say, well, still 5 million of them didn't vote. You know, why didn't that 5 million go to the polls? You know, we need to figure out where they are and what stopped them from going. We still have a small, compared to the past, but we have a percentage of folks who aren't registered at all. And I think some of them aren't registered because they don't think they can register.
Yeah.
You know, I think that is one of the real challenges. When I came into office, I one of the first bills I did had to deal with basically people who had the right to vote but didn't know they had it. You know, because while there's so much information that if you're a felon, you can't vote, we still have those kinds of issues out there. And I've gone sometimes to churches where ministers have said, I thought all my members voted. They told me they had. And then when I looked at the rolls and they hadn't, I went to some of them and asked what happened. And they whispered, I'm a felon. And he said, and I had to let them know that is not an obstacle. And people are so still embarrassed by not being able to vote in thinking that that's is California standard. So we have to do a better job of information, sharing that information. People who are in jail can vote. People don't know that. And so we've had some community groups going in the jails, helping people to not only to make sure they're registered, but also to make sure they get an absentee ballot if they're there for 60, 90 days. So we have to really do a better educational campaign about who can vote and why you should vote. You know, there are a lot of folks who understand, you know, what happens when you vote, but people don't understand what happens when you don't vote. And that's what we also want to help our communities to understand, that when they don't show up to vote, there are policies that are developed that people don't take them into consideration because they figure they're not exercising their right to vote, and therefore they can't really respond appropriately in terms of electing people who will support them in the policies that they develop. So I tell people it's horrible when you can't vote, but it's even worse when you don't vote, because at that point you've decided to give up your rights and you've given it to someone else. But it also sends a very strong message. And I've seen this when I was on the school board, that those people who look at communities that don't vote, look at them very differently. And they're not as responsive to their needs as they are to other communities. And so we have to make our communities understand that.
Very important. Yeah, the local elections often overlooked by voters. So you've been the California Secretary of State for 2.5 months now. Would you mind sharing with us your reaction to the call from Governor Newsom about your nomination?
Well, you know, I was very content, as I've always been relatively content in my life with the challenges and the opportunities I've had. And so I was very content as a legislator. You know, I thought I had done some good work, and I had interrupted my retirement to do it. And so I was looking forward to the retirement where I was supposed to build my house up in Jashi, up in West Africa. And hadn't thought about it at all. I was advocating for something totally different and hadn't really given much thought to the Secretary of State. And when people began to talk to me about it, it was just kind of surreal at a point, because I'm thinking, you know, I'm not sure if I'm a person who's in charge of a bureaucracy. You know, I mean, in many ways, that's what it turns out to be.
Right.
And I had to think hard and long about it. And then I had to realize that, you know, oftentimes, even when I ran for the assembly, I ran sometimes because one, you know, I think I still have a lot of stuff to give. You know, I still have an experience that others don't have. And putting that experience out there on the table helps people to understand it. And as I reflected on my own journey in terms of my parents and voting and those kinds of things, it's been one of the most important things my family has ever taught us to do, was to vote, my father and my mother. And so, you know, I had to think hard and long about it. And I tried not to reject too many experiences, because sometimes it becomes an opportunity for me to open the door for others. That if I look around and say, oh, I might be the only person who could do this as an African-American woman at this time, that has never happened in the history of California, to be a constitutional officer, to be this constitutional officer, it may open doors for others. And so I had to put away some of my own personal desires and my own comfort, because I was very comfortable in the assembly and getting things done, and take on new challenges that life presents you with, because that's what you're supposed to do. And I realized it was something probably within my family's experience and my own personal passion about voting that I could share with others. And I've been doing that. And as a result, people understand why it's so important to vote. And I think more than anyone, I know why it's important to vote. And I know what happens when you deny the right to vote, and also when you don't believe you have anything to vote for. And so I'm hoping to carry that message across California and across the nation to wake people up about this very important franchise.
So what was it like breaking the news to your family about your new job in Sacramento?
My family was shocked, but because I have six brothers and sisters that are still alive. Yeah. And it's interesting because we meet every Sunday, and I hadn't said a word to them until maybe the Sunday before the announcement, when I thought it might happen. And I said, this could possibly happen. And when I told them, they were just blown away. Yeah. They were shocked. And then they said, well, what would stand in your way? I said, well, it's the wish of the governor. And they said, if he offers it, would you take it? I said, I don't know. Do you think I should? And they all said, yes, why not? And I said, well, that's easy for you guys to say. You're already retired. You're enjoying your retirement. You do what you want every day with your life, so it makes it a little different. But they were surprised. And I wasn't really going to tell them, because it wasn't sure that I'd even be offered it. Yeah. And so it was really kind of hilarious and my son said, Mom, you should tell them, because if not, they'll be shocked. And I didn't even think it would happen that week, and 2 days later. So I didn't even get a chance to tell them it was going to happen until they saw it on the news. And then they said everybody who had known us from kindergarten was calling and asking, is this really Shirley? It's kind of one of those things. And that was interesting. Incredible. But I got a chance to tell my staff maybe an hour before the announcement, and they were shocked. And but it was, I had not, like I said, it was interesting that the governor had taken an interest in what I was doing, because I was doing other things. Yeah. And talking with him about all kinds of things. And it was not the Secretary of State that I was talking about. Yeah. But evidently he saw something in terms of, as he said, my drive and my passion, and that was important for California at this time. Yeah. Well,
certainly you've made so many contributions in the legislature that there are any number of things, but this is a very important endeavor you're on, both for the state and the nation at this time. And you mentioned that you have a story that you want to tell that goes along with this. And I wonder maybe if we could take a moment here today. You mentioned that you are the first African-American woman to hold this position of California Secretary of State. And what does that mean to you personally, and the journey that you and your family have been on in your life?
Yeah, I said it's somewhat ironic, because my father was a sharecropper, and my great-grandfather was a slave. Mm-hmm. And my great-great-grandfather was a slave, and my grandfather was a sharecropper himself, and could barely read, and never had a chance to vote in this country. He died in 1963, before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Wow. My father left Hope, Arkansas, because they were going to lynch him. And despite he was a sharecropper who fought for his rights and his wages that he was owed at the way station. And he was very outspoken and very vocal, and he became a liability. And so his family had to sneak him out of Arkansas in the middle of the night to put him on a train, because my mother's mother had come to California years earlier. And he came to California to save his life and to save our lives. 3 months later, he had worked enough to basically pay for his 6 children and wife to come to California. And so the first thing my father did was to make sure that all of us were serious about school, because he was denied an education. He could barely read, my dad. And he couldn't go beyond the 5th grade in Arkansas at that time, not young men, because they felt they were going to do nothing but work the fields. And so he insisted, he was adamant about us going to school, adamant about us. But he was also adamant about us voting, because he said, one, you get an education, nobody can take it from you. He said, two, if you even if you amass a lot of wealth and you get a lot of money, he said, they can take it from you in the laws that they write and the injustices that exist. And so he was very adamant about voting, so much so that my mother volunteered at the polls. And eventually, when we lived in the projects, but when we moved to a house on 45th in Los Angeles, our house became the voting poll.
Wow.
Because the school didn't have enough space for voting because of free and reduced lunches and what have you. So they needed a place to vote. And there was no library nearby. There was no rec center in that community. None of those things were available in that community. And so my mother volunteered our house. And so my dad said it was too important to be in the garage. So he had it in the living room. And he and my brother took the furniture out every election, primary, general, special, whatever it was in Los Angeles. And we had voting in our living room. And so as a result, whatever we knew, we'd walk down the driveway to go into the back door because my mother told us they were voting in the living room. And it was a sense of pride for my family to have their home, the voting place. And, 351 West 45th Street was a voting place. And everybody in the neighborhood knew they came to our house to vote. And then my parents were very proud about that. And it impacted our thinking as kids to have your house as a polling place, as a precinct, And I remember that, and we each registered to vote and voted, and those kinds of things. And my dad would take down all the voting equipment and drive my mother and the women down to the voting polls on the night of the election to make sure everything was turned in. But it was a sense of pride for them, and I'll never forget how important it was. And so even with me and my kids, even when I voted, I was always take them to the polls with me. And more recently, my daughter's election, she took her 2 kids with her to see them put her ballot in the box. It's a tradition in this family. And it was so important because my parents was denied the opportunity to vote, denied the opportunity. And I'm not sure if all of his brothers and sisters ever got a chance to vote in Arkansas. And so as a result, it was really like a statement of his freedom to be able to vote, to cast a vote, to pick his people, that pick his city council member and whomever it was. And he would go around and talk to all his friends about why they needed to vote and why it was important to vote. And we lived in the project, so a lot of the women were on welfare. And he would tell them, he said, you above all should vote because your whole life is dependent upon what the government does. And he was really, and they would look at him and he registered them to vote. He said, you got to learn, you got to vote because, he said, I have a job, but you don't have a job and the government is your income. So so for me and my family, as I thought about it, I said, here's people who never had a chance to vote. And now their daughter's responsible for 140 million Californians having the right to vote and standing firm on the fact that they have the right and the responsibility to exercise their right to vote. Yes.
Thank you very much. It's a very, very moving story. And for me, having heard about your family's experiences in Hope, Arkansas, it just changed the way I thought about the place, which I've never been, but which I heard about from,
Yes.
2 other famous politicians who had come from there, the 2 former governors of Arkansas, former president. And for me, it's just, your story, just reshaped my thinking around that. But your story about coming to California, also an important story for many, many Californians who can't come here with hopes for a better life and to be part of democracy. So moving, and so much appreciated. Dr. Weber, when you look at the nation and our state, what do you think are some of the main lessons that we learned about our democracy from the 2020 election in terms of voting in the election process?
I think, clearly there's like you mentioned, there's a lot that we celebrate. There's a lot of things that are there, but I was pleased with the fact that because I travel around the world and I see how they vote in South Africa and other places, and people wait for days and days and days, to vote because they understand the consequences of it. I think from 2020, I think our people should learn the consequences of not voting, from 2016, that we were in a state of turmoil, lack of leadership. And we've often figured, it doesn't really matter who is president of this country, it doesn't really matter who's this or that, we'll be okay because we've always been okay. We've always had this transference of power without chaos and confusion. And I've been in other countries where people are nervous when elections take place because they don't know whether this new person is going to change laws or instill some kind of military action or whatever. They're afraid. We've always had this comfort level. And I think at some point it has rocked our comfort level. Mm-hmm. And it should. Mm-hmm. It should. Because what we have is worth fighting for. And as I tell folks, even though we have this victory, we can't let it go because right now, those folks who have benefited from the low voter turnouts and the indifference that people have expressed are trying to bring that back. You would think that we'd be so happy that we had all these people to vote, almost 150 million people to vote in this country. Oh my God, you think we'd be waving flags and jumping up and down. And yet folks are in rooms and halls of Congress and assemblies and senates across the state that are strategizing and implementing policies to limit those who can vote without any evidence that the system did not work, without any evidence that it was corruption, that it failed, that it did the wrong thing. The only thing they felt was wrong was that it let people vote that they didn't want to vote. And so as a result, we have to be even more vigilant because in small ways and in large ways, these folks are trying to take away the right to vote. I mean, I think people kind of see it a little bit in Georgia when they say, you can't give a person a glass of water if they're standing in line. I mean, how crazy can you be? What is in the water? You think somebody's going to be drugged? And they realize that because the women, I work with the women, Win with Black women who are in Georgia, and they knew that people would come and they would create these situations where they'd have these long lines. They wouldn't have enough people to serve them, and people would get frustrated and tired and leave. So therefore, they bought food trucks that basically brought people food, that if you've been in line for a couple of hours, you could go get you some water, you could get something to eat, but they made sure people could stay there to sustain them to be there. What a humanitarian act that is, and here we are saying you can't be a humanitarian. You can't help people who are standing there about to pass out. Why? Because you really want to discourage them from voting. So we've learned a lot. I hope we've learned a lot about this democracy, how fragile it is and how it continues to be fragile because it's not over. The attacks on the Capitol last week, the attacks in January. I mean, these things are now very real, very, very real for us. And I hope that our young people see how real it is and begin to understand what happens around the world when people vote. And how we now have a situation where we could easily fall into one of those categories where people, every time there's an election, there's uproar, there's all kinds of challenges to it, those kinds of things that are really unfair and unjust. So I hope we have learned the importance of this democracy. I hope we have learned the importance of voting. Yes.
And what do you hope to see out of the 117th Congress, the Congress that's meeting now, that might strengthen and protect voting rights? What specifically would you like to see the Congress do?
Well, there's a lot of things in HR 1 that needs to happen. And I think that is
what's important about it.
Well, what's important about it is, one, it's going to once again, hopefully strengthen the whole idea that you can't create these barriers to people voting. That it's going to strengthen the Voting Rights Act that we had in 1965, and so will John Lewis one as well. That it keeps states from creating these obstacles, because what's happened now is our Supreme Court, in not doing the Voting Rights Act of 65, has said it's up to the states. And if people don't understand states' rights, which was part of the whole civil rights era, that's why I say it's so important that we educate folks about what took place and how this is so analogous of what we're seeing right now. Because on the surface, that sounds easy, simple. Yeah, every state should choose what they're going to do, but the Voting Rights Act, HR 1, basically reinforces that the federal government has a responsibility to talk about voting, that it has a responsibility to ensure that every Californian who's a citizen has a right to vote. Right now, it's placed in the hands of the individual 50 states. And we're going to see tremendous disparity and changes in that, whether it's the right to have an absentee ballot or not to have one. All those things are going to be manipulated at the local level, at the state level. And we're going to see what we saw back under Jim Crow in terms of those states that are going to basically create limited opportunities for folks to basically be able to vote. And at some point, voting is so important, it should be federal law about what happens at the federal level in terms of voting.
And I'm sure a lot of people who are on this Zoom meeting with us today have been hearing about the new voting law in Georgia, but maybe don't know the specific details. What are the details? You mentioned about no drinking water. That's
Yeah.
What are some of the details there that ought to get people's attention in terms of impacts on voting rights?
Well, they're changing they're limiting the number of days that you can have in advance for voting and trying to restrict that so that areas don't have any flexibility for that. They're doing that to try to make sure that there's not enough of that taking place. They're also restricting, which is really important, who can get an absentee ballot and who cannot. And before you could become you'd had 100 and some odd days to basically get an absentee ballot. Now they're narrowing it down to 70 some days. Which means there'll be a number of folks who will have difficulty getting it. You also have to have ID, 2 forms of ID to get it. And I think sometimes ID voting sounds good on the surface, but when people think about the fact of the number of folks in these states that have no birth certificates, we forget about that I was born at home, and unfortunately I have a birth certificate. I was born by midwife, and just so happened my uncle was a physician, and he would come through periodically and basically write these birth certificates. But and I assume my birthday is September 20th, one of those kind of things. But there are a lot of folks who don't have birth certificates. And as a result, how do they get this information? I don't think my father has a birth certificate, but had a birth certificate. And so what he would have gotten information from a census record, as we had to do with my grandmother, because there was no birth certificates for those out in those areas at the time. And so we act as if these things are just standard, and yet they're not. Yet the individual who's standing in front of you has been in that community all their life and has registered to vote. Now they have to have extra ID in order to get an absentee ballot, even though they're already a registered voter. So those kinds of barriers will limit the ability of people to get absentee ballots, which people saw that absentee ballots really work extremely well for people. And before, it used to be only for whites would do absentee ballots and blacks would not, because they didn't trust the system. And so as a result of a lot of work with Stacey Abrams and some of the others, they've begun to trust the voting system. So now people are willing to do absentee ballots. But I can remember when they would not do absentee ballots in Black communities at all, because they didn't trust who was taking the vote. Now people will. They're much more comfortable with it. As a result of COVID, they become a lot more comfortable. And so a lot of people voted by mail. Okay. This last election in San Diego, the vast majority of those who voted, there was only about 1,000 people actually showed up at the day of the election. The rest of the 60 some odd thousand folks who voted were all by mail. And so as a result of that, they're now trying to limit who can get it, limit how you get one, where you have to have all this ID in order to get it. And yet there's no evidence that there's ever been any fraud or any problem with it. And those things will be, once again, these challenges, these obstacles that prevent people from exercising their right to vote. Yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier the attack on the US Capitol, which was horrifying to watch on many levels. And the fact that it was set in the context of misinformation about a stolen election and about voter fraud. So how do you, as Secretary of State, approach the issue of confidence in elections, given just where we are in this country now about these conversations?
Even though we had a fairly calm election from the staff's perspective and in the city, we still had 40% or more, I think, that were telling me of people who thought something was wrong with the election. So based on the information that people are getting. And so we have a confidence issue that we have to do. And so what we've begun to do is to make sure that we have some in our outreach that we're helping people to understand what happens in the process and why things exist a certain way. Because that sometimes if they don't understand it and they don't know why they couldn't turn a ballot in at a certain time, then they think there's something programmed against them. So we're doing all these transparency conversations. But also we have some folks who are working our social media and making sure that we're increasing our folks with that, and making sure that anything that comes in that's incorrect, that we respond to it immediately. Because you get these, you're going to check signatures on this, but you're not going to check signatures on that, and they don't even understand the various laws and rules that determine when we collect signatures. So we have some folks who are on social media that are employed by us to basically respond to those issues rather quickly, so that they don't have a chance to grow and fester. And so that we want to be able to do that and be able to put out, we put out a toolkit for all of our departments, and that became important for them to, for all of our registrar voters to put out to their people to say, look, here's some strategies and ways, and here's some things that you can look at to do that, to kind of relieve the tension around voting. But we have to continue to do that because the other side is still putting out negative information consistently. Misinformation, and the misinformation campaigns are rather strong.
Yeah. And you enter the role of Secretary of State in a year in which signature verification is now underway for a recall of Governor Newsom. And in reading about the recall, and obviously many Californians are, I'd like for people to understand what your role as Secretary of State is. It's often described as the referee in a governor's recall. But people have different ideas about what referee means. So can you explain what your role?
My role in the recall is like my
in the special election.
Yeah. My role, if there's a recall, my role is the same role it is in all of the elections, to make sure that that the process is fair.
Yeah.
That the material that what we're doing is done by policy, that it's transparent, that people can see what we're doing. Yeah. To make sure that everybody has a fair shot at what is going on, and to make sure that our 58 counties are implementing the law as it is. And I'm the person who will receive the petitions eventually, but the counting occurs at the county level. It doesn't occur at my level. Someone says, you're not going to count them all. I said, well, I can count them all. If I do, you'll never have a recall, because it will take the next 7 years for me to do that. But we rely upon our counties, and they send us the numbers, and I look forward to seeing the numbers on the 19th of this month. And the raw numbers that will be coming in, because they're verifying what they have now. So we have to verify that every signature is counted in a recall. Every signature is looked at, verified, and that happens at the county level. And then they send it to us at the state level. And we basically check the numbers, verify some things, because sometimes there's some inconsistencies in numbers. And then we will determine whether or not there's enough ballot signatures for a recall. At that point, we also then work with the lieutenant governor is actually the person who actually calls a recall and identifies the date. But things like looking at the budget, we have to go through a budget process. We also have to go through a process for people to take their names off the recall. And if folks don't want to be on the recall, I think there's 30 days that they have to basically ask to have their name removed. That they can do that. There's a process for that. Then we have a process for a budget, because the recalls are very expensive. And I think the last one they told me at the state level was $150 million at the state, and that does not count the counties. Okay, and of course things have gone up since then. And the counties pay for the recall, so the counties are concerned that it's affecting their budget as well as the state budget. So we will, and once it goes through that process and what have you, and we get to some understanding, then the lieutenant governor has, I think, 60 to 80 days from the time that everything is verified to basically call it. Based on all the time frames and things that happen, a recall probably wouldn't occur before November, December. Yeah, that time frame, if there's a recall election. Yeah.
And would there be state propositions on the ballot too?
No, there won't be state propositions
No
on the
state
ballot.
propositions
Last time, I
on the
think
ballot.
some propositions got on and people complained about,
Right.
and we've had some who want to be on and some who don't want to be
Yeah.
on. And so in order not to confuse folks and give an appearance that we're trying to drive people to the poll or
Yeah.
drive them away from the polls, we will, my understanding is we will not have any propositions on the ballot.
And we are in the midst of a global pandemic, and I'd like to get your sense of where you think California is in terms of the COVID crisis that we've been in for over a year, and then how does it impact your planning for an election that might take place later in the year?
Well, it's we're. I guess at some point I'm optimistic in terms of where we are. I felt like I was on a hamster trail going around in a circle with the last administration.
Yeah.
And we were never going to get out. I think most of us now have a feeling that there may be an end to the tunnel. At least we have leadership that is directing us there, and it's getting better. And so I think at this point, we'll be in a better place. We're looking at opening schools and those things that we have done. The governor's preparing to open up more facilities with caution. Hopefully people still have caution about it. So I think we finally have some direction. I mean, we've got the leadership at the federal level that actually recognizes that this is a problem, that we're in a pandemic, rather than one that's denying it. And then we're constantly fighting about what's right, what's wrong, what should we do, what shouldn't we do. At least now we have clear direction that matches science and leadership, and we're moving. And I think everybody I talk to is like, hallelujah. We are finally going in a direction. So I think that that is going to help us immensely. We still are not back at full workforce in terms of of the Capitol and state buildings and things of that nature. We're like 20-25% in the Secretary of State's office. So I'm hopeful that we will be back up to speed, but it will have some impact. But I think the impact will be interesting enough. Like I said, in COVID, the election, the impact was positive. Where we put resources into election, we open up opportunities. Those who ran the election said they got more support and more attention and more resources than ever before, and had the smoothest election they ever had, and was shocked that this happened. So that's why I say we have to learn from what we did before and do it again if we have to do it in this year, in terms of the elections. But given COVID and those kinds of things, hopefully people will want to go out to vote. They will feel a sense of it. They felt a sense of urgency in the last election. Yeah. I'm hoping they will feel the same sense of urgency if there is a recall, because that is a very important act to take place, and it shouldn't be done with the minority of our population. It should be as great a turnout as we had for the November election, because it is a very important statement.
And everybody would be mailed a ballot,
everybody will be mailed a ballot. Everyone will get a mail ballot. We will implement the same things we did before in terms of time frame, of having more than one day to vote, having vote centers, having a vote box, ballot boxes. We will do the same thing that we did during the other election to make it accessible and convenient for Californians to vote.
Which was historically high turnout. And yes, from everything people are reading, I think they'll get the sense that this is important. Yes. If it takes place, it'll be important for them to vote. So we're at 11:45, and I'd like to go ahead and answer some questions and then come back to some others that I had hoped to ask you. As a reminder, please submit your questions to PPIC event questions at gmail.com, PPIC event questions at gmail.com. Here's a question from one member of our audience, and I hear this quite often, and probably you do too, but voters often ask why we can't vote online. Dr. Weber, explain why California is not voting online, and if we can expect this in the future.
Well, there's a lot of effort at mobile voting, and we're looking into it. We have a law against any of our ballots, period, being placed on the internet, online. So we actually have a law that prevents us from doing that. Now, that doesn't mean that law can't change. But one of the problems that it happens is that we have had difficulty in making sure that that internet voting is secure. And that's the real issue, much more than anything else. given all of the hackings and the online things that occur, we have hesitation even about doing our own balloting online and making sure that there is a paper trail for the ballots that are done through the various machines. And so we actually have legislation that says you can't vote online. And but that doesn't stop us from looking into it. And we are looking into it in the same way. We're looking at a remote online notary. We're looking at that in California now. Some other states have implemented. And so we're doing some workshops on that to see if that's something we can implement because of what happened during the pandemic and the need for it. But we're also looking at mobile voting and seeing what's out there. We're working with the groups to see what's out there. Is it possible? And given the naysayers that are out there already, it makes it difficult to just implement something like that without a high level of confidence that it is secure.
Yeah. Thank you for your answer to that. So you mentioned earlier about the importance of civic education, and this is something which, from time to time, other Secretary of States have talked about, the Chief Justice has talked about, Superintendent of Public Instruction. And I'd like to get your sense of, because you're an educator and somebody who has served on school boards, of what do you mean when you talk about civic education in the context of the work that you do as Secretary of State, and what would be your vision of what we would be doing in California?
Yeah. We do some things now with our high schools and our colleges, mainly around encouraging them to vote in competitions around who votes the most and those kinds of things. But in our high school efforts, we're looking at trying to, working with our state superintendent, trying to enhance more of our knowledge about the United States and its journey to voting and what a democracy is. Our education is rather thin in those areas. And so we end up with young people who don't really know much about voting. They don't know much about the democracy. They don't understand how to participate in it. We should have more participation in democracy, because once you participate in the process of either helping someone vote or an initiative or whatever it may be, you become kind of an advocate for life. You can't turn away from that experience because you see how hard it is to work on issues. And so we want to make sure that as we talk about not only just the education, the academic, but the internships and the support for students being able to go out and do community service in the area of civic education, working at their city council office, working in their judges' chambers, being a part of the legislature. We have a number of internships at the Secretary of State's office that's college students, and it's actually paid internships. And I've asked to look at them all, and we put together a brochure because I want students to start working in the Secretary of State, to see what we do, see why it's so important, and how they can participate in it. So it becomes real important that our young people know what a democracy is, how it operates, be a part of it, do some work in it, those kinds of community activities are there, because when you do that, it really makes you a lifelong participant. When I've had students when I first ran for school board, who participated in my school board election, they said it is difficult for them, one, not to read the paper every morning because they think something's going to happen. And two, it is almost impossible for them to have an election go by and they not do something, phone bank or something, because they remember we remember how hard it was to get every voter to the poll, that kind of thing. And that's important, that engagement is a lifelong engagement that you just don't turn your back on. Yeah.
Well, that's very exciting. And based from where I sit, I think there'll be a lot of interest in that, because I'm always getting calls and requests from people about what can I do? How can I become more involved, especially those who are currently going to college. Here's another question from the audience. Richard Winger on Ballot Access News. Do you favor changing the top two primary system established by Prop 14?
That has become, I've never liked that system and still don't. Okay. And let me tell you why. I think it disenfranchises the small parties, and I realized that when I was running that the only time a peace and freedom party or Green Party person or whomever would actually run would be if there was no one running against me, and they would wait right to the end, and then they would jump in as a write-in candidate. And I couldn't figure out why initially. And then I realized that's the only way that they're going to actually get on the ballot. Right. Because if it's a Democrat, Republican, and then there's a Green Party, the Green Party is never going to get on the ballot. And so we have really taken away the opportunity for the other voices to actually be a part of the general election. And so in looking at it, and most folks didn't think about that when it happened, that you're making it impossible for these other parties, other than the two main parties, to actually ever be voted by the public itself, who might choose one of those. And so I think it disenfranchises those other parties, those other voices, because when you have two major parties always on the ballot, if you notice, you don't get these other people on the ballot at all. Yeah. You know, it's just Democrat, Republican, where before, at least in the other primaries, they had their primaries, they had their candidate, and when it came down to vote, we could actually see the other candidates and the other parties, and their voices were heard, and they attended forums, and they were part of the discussions. And at least if they didn't win, at least their ideas were included in the conversation. And right now they're not. Yeah.
And it would take another vote by the people to change that law.
And interestingly enough, those who got the law in, and I've talked to some of them, realized that it didn't change much in terms of outcome.
Yep.
Okay, we're still getting those people. And the only people who really benefited from it were people who run campaigns.
Interesting. Isn't that something?
That they're making buku money, because if it's two Dems running against each other in a Democratic area, a lot of money is spent. If it's a Dem and a Republican running in a predominantly Democratic area, you're not going to spend as much money in that election. So they resolved, when they honestly said to me, the only people we see now who benefited from it were those who actually run the elections and write all the brochures and the materials and the consultants, and not the citizens of California.
Thank you. Here's another question. This is from Diane with the San Mateo County Voter Education and Outreach Advisory Committee. With the passage of Prop 17 on the November 2020 ballot, people on parole can now register to vote. This is something, of course, you mentioned earlier. It's been a challenge to educate formerly incarcerated folks. What is the Secretary of State's office doing to inform people about their right to vote, and how can local, I think this part also important, how can local organizations also help to get the word out? So what can people on the ground do, not just
Well, one of the first things I did and made sure we did is I have sent a letter to every person who's on parole to let them know they have the right to vote.
And how many people are we talking about?
I think it's someone told me like 50,000 or something like that. It's 50,000 people, because parole can last a long time, you know.
Yeah, so that's 50,000 people who
exactly
vote or think that they can't vote.
Exactly. So it's a large number of individuals we've sent to them. We've also sent letters to the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to hopefully update and educate their parole officers that they should let people know that. I think we were looking at it, and because I came in late this time, and we'll see, I'm looking at hopefully a piece of legislation that will require everybody in CDCR to give a person who's leaving prison to register them to vote.
Interesting.
And just like we sometimes require them to give them a driver's license and some other things that they need to have in order to function, we also need to do that. So we are looking at, but we've already sent the notice out. We've sent notice, we're planning a campaign to deal with a lot of the churches and community organizations. And if there's a community organization that would like to partner with us, you know, call the Secretary of State's office. We have our outreach people are reaching out into all those areas to make sure those folks who would benefit from Prop 17 know that they have the right to vote. And we'll be engaged in a number of campaigns to make that happen.
Can I ask you a question about another proposition that was on the ballot in November on expanding the electorate that didn't pass? That was Proposition 18, which would have allowed 17-year-olds in primaries who were, you know, before they became 18 to vote. And, you know, remarkably, Prop 17 passed by just about 60-40, and Prop 18, it was 40-60. It didn't pass. And how are you thinking about expanding the electorate when it comes to younger voters, because so often we hear that younger voters don't vote in the numbers that older voters do, or in the proportions.
Yeah, I thought that would have passed. And I think what happens always is that people are, I don't know if we get voter fatigue and we get to the end of, or get somewhere, there's so many things being asked, it's just one more thing you don't want to do.
Yeah.
And I think as legislators, there's always been an effort to try to lower the age of voting. It hasn't necessarily matched the public's desire to do so.
Mm-hmm.
Folks figure it's hard enough to get the 18-year-olds to vote. What
Yeah.
about the others? We do allow them to register in advance if they're going to be 18 by that time, and that way we can get them registered in high school and make that happen. And then we need to put more of an effort to get them to the polls. Because just registering them and giving them the opportunity without them being encouraged to go to the polls or having something to go to the polls for, as some people argue, is there. But why it didn't pass, it was interesting. There were a lot of things that were working, and I think it was interesting that 17 passed, because 17 didn't have a tremendous amount of money, but it just sounded reasonable. And I think maybe because of the George Floyd situation, it's hard to tell exactly what the variable was, because I was one of the co-authors on 17 when it was, and I was shocked that it passed so easily, because we didn't have the time to put a lot of energy into it, and we didn't have a lot of money for it. We were focusing on other things. But I think people just felt, I don't know. It's hard to say what motivated them to vote for one and not for the other, So, yeah.
Yes. And for me, as somebody who does the polling too, and we could also talk about Prop 16 in the same way, which surprised me. Didn't expect, but maybe some other time. I can't believe it, but we're just about at the end of our program. And I wanted to have a chance to ask you before we end, as we continue to, as a state and a nation, emerge from the pandemic, confront longstanding structural racism, what gives you the most hope looking ahead?
I think what gives me the most hope is that as I look at some of the things we attempted to accomplish in the last few years, and we've done some of them. But I feel that finally, as I'm listening, as I've left the assembly, and I'm listening to my colleagues and looking at the bills that they are authoring, I'm inspired that some of them have taken up some of those things that we tried to do and couldn't do, that there's a new fire to try to bring change. And I think that along with the public's desire to hold us accountable, to watch us more, is really, really important. And we're looking for people who are going to bring change, so I'm enthusiastic about it. I was, as you know, my daughter won my seat, and that it was not by me pushing her to run. It was by her desire to try to bring change, which is shocking to me that she'd want to do it. But so that gives me hope that even young people who have, great futures ahead of them in different areas, and she's a physician, and still wants to do something else in addition to that. So there's a lot of energy in the elected young people that are coming forward, as I see what's happening in the 54th and some other areas. Folks who believe they can do things. And I've had a lot of young people who told me they didn't think things could happen until I got a lot of my bills passed and got them out of the House. And now they're all fired up because they think they can bring change, and they can. And so that was one of my goals, to try to set an atmosphere that all things are possible. That we can actually deal with some of the structural racisms and some of the inequities and all those things that are out there. And there's still so much more to do. But if you put your foot down and you put your shoulder to the grindstone, you can get it done. And I think there's a sense of optimism that it can happen now. Yes.
Well, hearing you say that makes me more optimistic. And I'm sure I speak for everybody who's listened in today. Thank you. Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber, thank you for joining us, and thank you for your service. And I hope this is the beginning of many more conversations.
I am sure it will be. We'll count on you to help us with a lot of our efforts to educate California.
You can
thank
count
you so
on
much
us.
For what you're doing. I know. Thank you so much for what you're doing.
On us, and thank you so much. I'd like to again thank our sponsors and for all of you for joining us today. Later today, you'll receive a survey. Please let us know how we did. Thank you. Please be safe. and have a good afternoon.